All right, so you know how it is. You really want to get a handle on what's actually going on, Not just the official stuff, but the real deal, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And well, today we're going to dive into something pretty heavy, honestly. We're talking about the Russian military, and what we're looking at comes straight from, well, kind of unexpectedly, from Russian soldiers themselves. It's pretty wild.
Yeah, it's heavy stuff.
And this is all being analyzed by, well, he's a Ukrainian blogger and journalist.
Right, right.
We're looking at a video from this guy, Denis Kazansky, his YouTube channel. You familiar with him at all?
Yeah, I've seen his stuff before.
Yeah.
Seems pretty plugged in, to what's going on over there.
Yeah, he's been looking at, well, basically he's been going through these posts by Russian military bloggers on Telegram. And I mean, this isn't like, state-run media or anything. These are people like right in the thick of it in the, what Russia's calling its special military operation.
Yeah, the guys on the ground.
And they're sharing some, well, let's just say some pretty disturbing stories about what's happening right in their own units, even.
Yeah, that's what Kazansky is sort of picking up on, right? It's like these aren't outsiders looking in. It's them, the Russians themselves, saying this stuff.
Exactly, exactly. And what he's pulled together from all these different Telegram channels, he focuses a lot on this one called Soldatskaya Pravda, run by Mikhail Polinkov. He's like a colleague of Igor Girkin.
Oh, yeah, I've heard that name.
Yeah, so I mean, he's, in that circle. And the picture that emerges from all this is, I mean, it's just horrifying. Straight up, it's Russian soldiers talking about brutal treatment. And not from the enemy, but from their own commanders.
On their own side.
Yeah. And Kazansky, he kind of takes it a step further and connects it to, well, what might be happening to Ukrainians, in the occupied territories. I mean, if they're doing this to their own guys.
It's a chilling thought, isn't it?
It really is. And even the title of his video, it kind of sets the stage, It's called, and I'll try my best here, «Эти слова российских воинов показывает Скабеева. Запрещенная правда об СВО, обнуление поборы ями».
Oh, okay.
Which basically means these words of Russian soldiers will not be shown by Skabeva. Forbidden truth about this special military operation. Zeroing out extortion pits.
Zeroing out extortion pits. That's heavy. And who's Kabeva? Is that one of their, big media people?
She's like a major, big-time propagandist on Russian state TV. So, I mean, right there in the title, he's saying this stuff is, so bad they won't even touch it.
Makes sense.
And you can tell Kazansky is, genuinely shocked by what he's found. And he asks this question that just sticks with you. He says, if this is how Russian commanders are treating their own soldiers, what on earth are they doing to Ukrainian civilians and prisoners of war?
Yeah. I mean, it's the question, isn't it? You can't not ask it after hearing all that.
Right. And the fact that this is coming from inside Russia, from these military bloggers and Telegram channels like Polenkov's, I mean, that just gives it, so much more weight. It's hard to write it off as just Western propaganda,
Oh, absolutely. It's their own people saying this. So where do we start with all of this?
Well, the first account that Kazansky really dives into is this guy, Lieutenant Dmitry Sokolov. He's from Military Unit 12273, which is part of the 7th Regiment, 6th Division. And his story, it's rough, man. Really rough.
Okay, lay it on me.
So Sokolov, he says, his friend, Anatoly Savin, he was from Chita, was what they call zeroed out.
Zeroed out. I've heard that term, but what does it actually mean?
It means killed.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And they did it. They zeroed him out because he refused to participate in, they call it a meat assault.
A meat assault? So what, like a suicide mission?
Pretty much, yeah. These were attacks with, no cover, no strategy, just sending guys in to get slaughtered. And Sokolov said that units sent in before them, they all got wiped out completely.
So they're just throwing lives away.
Yeah.
Their own people.
Yeah, and it gets worse. Sokolov, he talks about this thing called the yama, which means pit. And get this, Savin, he got thrown into this pit, and it was on the orders of his battalion commander, this guy they called Sultan from the 37th Regiment. And there was another commander involved, call sign Uzor, who's since been moved to a tank regiment, I guess. Anyway, after they put Savin in the pit, he disappeared.
Disappeared, just gone.
Gone.
Jesus.
Yeah, and Sokolov, he says he saw the pit himself. He described it as having bars, locks, armed guards. You're not getting out of that thing.
I think a prison for their own soldiers.
Yeah, and Sokolov is terrified. I mean, understandably. He says he's too scared to report any of this through, the official channels, He's afraid they'll do the same thing to him.
Can you blame him?
No way. So he's saying he'll only testify through, legal representatives. I mean, that shows you the level of distrust within their own system.
Yeah, it's completely broken down, hasn't it? I mean, digging pits to punish your own soldiers,
Yeah.
it's beyond messed up. You wonder how anyone can function in that environment, you know? What's the impact on, like, morale and trust?
It's got to be devastating, right?
Yeah, totally.
And this is where Kazansky, the Ukrainian blogger, he points something out.
What's that?
He says it's so hypocritical, like Russian state media is always talking about Ukrainian mobilization, how bad it is, blah, 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 but they never mention any of this stuff, how their own soldiers are being treated. It's total silence.
Yeah, they're deflecting, right?
Oh.
Focusing on the enemy instead of their own problems. Classic tactic.
Exactly. But it's not just the Yama thing. Sokolov talks about other stuff, too, like wounded soldiers getting sent right back to the front lines.
Wait, what? Without any, like, medical treatment?
Yeah. They just dumped them in the green zone. That's what they call it. Probably some supposedly safer area nearby, I guess. But no real medical care, no documentation of their injuries, nothing.
That's insane. So these guys are getting wounded, and their own side is just throwing them back into the meat grinder.
Basically, yeah. And we're not talking minor injuries here. I mean, these were guys forced into those meat assaults I mentioned, charging into heavy fire from drones, mortars, direct enemy fire. And no cover, no artillery support, no counter-battery fire. Just sent in to die, pretty much.
God, the losses must be astronomical.
Yeah, Sokolov makes it sound like just total carnage. And then there's the corruption. Sokolov talks about this whole system they had going of fabricating injury reports.
Yeah, like making stuff up.
Yep. He said one soldier could have, like, multiple fake injuries documented. And that would lead to millions of rubles in payouts, like fraudulent payouts. And guess who was sharing that money?
The commanders, I'm guessing.
Bingo. The officers were pocketing it. It's like they were profiting off their own soldiers' injuries. It's just, I don't even know what to say.
It's sickening. I mean, it just shows how deep this corruption runs. It's not just on some abstract level. It's literally life or death for these guys.
Yeah. And Kazansky, he makes this point that the brutality in the army, it's like a mirror of what's happening in Russia in general. He says the whole country is built on corruption. And the guys who are fighting in this aggression, he says they're actually fighting to keep that system in place. And if anyone speaks out against it, tries to expose it, boom, discrediting the army, off to prison you go.
It's messed up. They're trapped in this cycle of abuse, and they're the ones upholding it.
Exactly. And to make things even more tragic, Kazansky brings in the mother of Anatoly Sabin, the soldier who got zeroed out. Her name is Lydia Mikhailovna Malasheva. And, man, her testimony is just heartbreaking. It's hard to even listen to.
I can't imagine what she's going through.
She confirms everything Sokolov said. Her son, killed by his own commanders for refusing to go on a suicide mission. I mean, the irony is just, it's unbearable.
It's a tragedy. And it makes you think, like Kazansky says, how can they justify this? How can they say they're fighting for some noble cause, for higher ideals, when they're doing this to their own people? It just doesn't add up.
Right, and Kazansky's take on it is pretty straightforward. He says there are no ideals here. It's all mercenary. The aggression, the brutality, it's all driven by greed. These commanders, they're just in it for themselves. And when that's a motivation, when there's no sense of duty, no higher purpose, then this is what you get. Just utter disregard for human life.
Yeah, you take away any kind of moral compass, and it's a recipe for disaster. And sadly, it doesn't end there. Sokolov's account is just the tip of the iceberg. Kazansky brings up another story, another soldier, this time a guy named Dmitry Kolyadov.
Kolyadov.
Yeah, he's from military unit 95378, also known as 33037.
Okay, and what happened to him?
Well, his situation is really bad, honestly. He says he had to run away from the front lines. He's actually hiding out in the Donetsk People's Republic.
In the DPR?
Yeah, because his own commander, a guy named Nazarenko Alexander Valerevich, call sign Freestyle, threatened to zero him out. He's basically on the run from his own side. And he's begging for help from, like, law enforcement, the Ministry of Defense, anyone who'll listen.
So he doesn't even trust his own chain of command to protect him?
Nope. And what's really scary is how much his story overlaps with what Sokolov was saying.
So it's not just an isolated thing.
Exactly. It seems like this kind of abuse, this brutality, it's happening all over. Different units, different commanders, same story.
So what was it about Kolyadov that made this Nazarenko guy want to zero him out?
Well, Kolyadov says that Nazarenko accused him of not being helpful enough to the battalion. Get this. The example he gives is that Kolyadov supposedly refused to buy the commander something.
Are you serious?
Dead serious. It's pure abuse of power. And the extortion, it comes up again and again in Kolyadov's story. He says he was forced to pay a compensation, basically a bribe, for taking leave to go to his own father's funeral, under a threat of being killed, of course.
It's like a mafia, not a military.
That's exactly what it sounds like. It's a system where soldiers have to pay to avoid getting killed or mistreated by their own commanders. It's just unimaginable. And Kolyadov backs up the claims about wounded soldiers being sent back to fight without support. And he says that soldiers who disobeyed orders, well, they just get killed by their own side.
He says he never thought he would have to hide from his own people to stay alive. That's just heavy, man.
Yeah, it's a gut punch. And it all circles back to that question that Kazansky keeps asking. If this is how they treat their own guys, what are they doing to the Ukrainians? How can anyone claim they're behaving humanely, with restraint? It just defies logic.
It's impossible to believe that after hearing all of this.
Exactly. And Kolyadov, he goes into even more detail about this Nazarenko guy, Fristyle. Says he would send soldiers on suicide missions, give reckless orders while he was drunk.
Drunk? Oh, man, that's just...
Yeah, gets worse. Kolyadov tells this story about a group of soldiers who got killed by a drone. And what were they doing? Fetching beer for Nazarenko in Novotroitsky.
Just unbelievable.
Right. And the financial exploitation was apparently insane under this guy. Kolyadov says that in February, after they'd taken huge losses, like a whole new batch of soldiers arrived. And Nazarenko forced them to pay massive sums of money, millions of rubles.
Millions.
Millions. And he says that the soldiers who paid up were taken away, probably to hand over the cash, and that's it. Nobody knows what happened to them.
Oh, God.
Yeah, Kolyadov specifically mentions one soldier, call sign Pozivnoy, and his group just vanished.
So they were probably...
It's not looking good. And Kolyadov is adamant that he didn't desert. He says he was forced to hide to save his own life from his own commanders. And he's pleading for an investigation, for someone to do something, to bring some order to this chaos. It's a desperate cry for help.
Yeah.
And Kazansky, in his final analysis of Kolyadov's account, he really hits on the tragedy of all of this. He says these soldiers are literally fighting to protect the system that's abusing them. This system of corruption, lawlessness, where their lives mean nothing.
And the worst part is they probably don't even realize it, right?
Right. They're trapped. And Kazansky, he's hoping that somehow, by getting this information out there, by telling these stories, maybe, just maybe, it'll break through to people in Russia, that they'll see what's really happening.
It's a long shot, but yeah, maybe.
And he ends the video with a call to action. He's asking people to share this information as widely as possible, especially with anyone they know in Russia, to try and break through the propaganda, to get the truth out there.
Yeah, it's got to start somewhere, right?
Exactly. So let's recap. What are the big takeaways here?
Yeah.
These testimonies from Russian soldiers, they paint a picture of widespread brutality and corruption in the Russian army. And I mean, this isn't about how they treat the enemy. This is about their own commanders brutalizing their own soldiers. It's their own people.
And the scale of it, the kinds of things they're talking about, zeroing out, extortion, physical abuse, it's just, well, frankly, it's terrifying. And Kazansky makes this point, and it's really important to understand what's happening within the Russian military. It directly impacts how we need to think about what's happening in Ukraine. If they're doing this to their own, what are they doing to the Ukrainians?
And that's the question that lingers, right? It's the question Kazansky leaves us with. If a military treats its own soldiers like this, what does it say about how they'll treat those they consider the enemy?
It's a really disturbing thought.
Yeah, and it just emphasizes how important it is to look at all sides of this, to be critical, to not just accept the official narrative. We need to understand the full picture, as horrifying as it might be.
Absolutely. Well, that's about all the time we have for today. As always, thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
And keep asking the tough questions.
Yeah, never stop questioning. And
Yeah.
we'll see you next time.